The article that we've been reading goes on from a discussion of particular symbols. It's worth looking at also the snake, the serpent. We've done that in class a lot. And the idea of the archetypal woman, gardens, trees, deserts. The article does admit that it's not an exhaustive list, and it's hard to come by to find a dictionary of symbols and their meanings. But I would argue that there are definitely symbols that have universal meanings, and then conversely, symbols that have meanings particular to their text or the context that they appear in. And it's up to an analytical and critical thinker to determine which is which. Also mentioned are archetypal motifs and patterns. This is on page 154 of the article. Creation is mentioned, and indeed you see creation stories abundant in any kind of mythology. Also the idea of the afterlife, of immortality, questions of time and the cyclical nature of time. It's the way that time seems to conquer everything, and the natural cycles of death and regeneration that we see in civilizations and in nature itself. The hero archetype is also important in any mythological system. The idea of a hero going off on some quest, battling some kind of challenge, whether it's with monsters, a literal type of like a literal challenge, or a figurative challenge, such as Hamlet's quest to wrestle with the riddles of existence. And one of my favorite and important motifs, archetypal motifs, is this idea of the sacrificial scapegoat, the hero with whom the welfare of the tribe or nation is identified, the scapegoat that must die. I'm quoting from the article right now. That must die to atone for people's sins and to restore the land to fruitfulness. We will come back to the idea of the scapegoat a little later when we apply archetypal criticism to Hamlet. I'm going to skip over archetypes as genres on page 155, but again, it's worth looking at. Myth criticism in practice. This is section 3 of the article on page 155. And there's an important literary critic by the name of Northrop Frye. And again, as mentioned earlier, the job of the myth critic is to look at what gives literature its vitality, what gives it, to quote the article, what gives a work of literature its inner spirit. And Northrop Frye says that in order to understand this, we have to look at archetypes and see literature as an expression of the depth of humankind. And Carl Jung would say to see literature as the expression of the complexity and inner workings of the collective unconscious. And it's striving to make itself concrete through symbols and through human beings' experience of them, through the human beings' encounter and creation of symbols that are born out of the DNA, if you will, of the unconscious. Anthropology is also another important facet for this task. And so we're going to go back a little bit further in history. Northrop Frye is still alive today, somewhere in Canada, famous literary critic. But prior to him, around 1890, there was this fellow named James Fraser, very important. And he did a widespread anthropological look at religion, and in particular magic and ritual. And he posited the assertion that, quote, mankind's his main contribution was that, quote, he wanted to demonstrate the essential similarity of man's chiefs' wants everywhere and at all times. He was saying that all mankind has the same basic needs and wants, and our worldview is organized around this. He says that, quote, under the names of Osiris, Tammuz, Adonis, and Attis, the peoples of Egypt and Western Asia represented the yearly decay and revival of life, especially vegetable life, which they personified as a god who annually died and rose again from the dead. In name and detail, the rites varied from place to place. In substance, they were the same, end quote. So Fraser is pointing out that again and again throughout different cultures, especially cultures connected to agriculture, you have these god figures that are constantly dying and regenerating. He was very fixated on the archetype of crucifixion and resurrection. And he said that there were a lot of myths that describe this process. One of the most interesting one is the way that he tracked the killing of the divine king. And it takes a little bit of explaining to get through this, but it's worth hearing me out on this one. There was this idea that existed in ancient agricultural societies that kings were, and the high chiefs of agricultural societies were given their power by the divinity, whatever that god might have been at the time. Now, the welfare and the strength of these divinely ordained rulers is the prime determinant for the success, the abundance of the vegetative crops. So if you had a very strong king, then that meant you would have a very good crop yield. Now, if you had a famine or a plague of some kind, that perhaps could mean that you had an alien king. What to do if you had an alien king who was the cause of a suffering crop yield or some sort of famine or plague or sickness? Well, you had to kill the king and get a new one. And oftentimes kings would give themselves up to such sacrifices. And Fraser recorded examples of this, and his work sought to provide evidence and make this argument that, this was a common practice found throughout all different cultures, this idea of the divine king being tied to the welfare of his people and his land. As people evolved somewhat, the concept changed a little bit. They would, instead of killing the king himself, they would trade the king out at regular intervals, or they would do a mock killing of a king, a mock sacrifice that, in a sense, fulfilled the same symbolic purpose. And then later on, there was the idea of the scapegoat archetype mentioned earlier. And you see this occurring in Judaism in the Old Testament, the idea that in order to atone for the sins of the tribe, on a yearly basis, one had to find, and the word scapegoat comes from goat, and the tribes would find the perfect, most unblemished goat, young, youthful, innocent, totally perfect, and they would have to kill it as a sacrifice. And somehow by killing something perfect and innocent, the sins that the whole tribe had committed, whatever wrongdoing, whatever spiritual decay that had taken place amongst the tribe, that was magically transferred onto the scapegoat. And by killing it, it fulfilled some sort of redemption. And it placed people back in line with the divine way. Greek theater comes right into play with this. And in fact, the tragedies so famous in ancient Greece, where actually theater was born, and the festivals of Dionysus, they depicted a similar type of violence. Oedipus, the king, Oedipus Rex, is a really famous example of this. And he himself actually is the perpetrator that, unbeknownst to him, has caused the famine and the plague that is running across his land. And he has to sacrifice himself in order to atone for the land, to make it become pure again. If you aren't familiar with the Oedipus story, spoiler alert, but basically it has to do with, and you might have heard it, I think some of you, we went over this in the psychology, mythology, and literature class, but Oedipus accidentally fulfills his destiny by marrying his mother, killing his father, and so you don't need to do much of a stretch to see how the theme of incest and also the theme of the corruption within the state causing a pollution of the entire land surrounding the kingdom. You see those two themes coming up in Hamlet.